So thank you very much. I'm grateful to NKSS for inviting me to talk with all of you today. It'd be so much better if we could do this in person, but this way at least we get to have people from really all over the country. I think probably all over the country. I believe that the recordings will be available. I don't know what Ginny has in mind. I'm responding to the question about whether the slideshow will be available.
Professor Jung-Kim, are you okay that we share your slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's get started. Originally, I was supposed to talk about, pretty much an overview of Korean history, but it was changed to focus on wars, which I think is a really good way of looking at this broad time period. So here we have a series of maps showing how the boundaries of Korea changed. So here we have Old Chosun, we have the Three Kingdoms period where Goryeo is flourishing, then we have the Three Kingdoms period where Shilla is growing, and then we have the period of unified Shilla with Pare to the north, and then Goryeo and Chosun. So you see that the boundaries have been consistent really since 1392, but before that, it really did vary. Okay, so I'm going to start with the Three Kingdoms period. It lasted from roughly 50 BCE before Common Era to the 7th century Common Era. There were actually 3 kingdoms plus Kaya. Now, 4 is a bad luck number in East Asia. 3 kingdoms is much better, and Kaya didn't last as long, although certainly by our contemporary understanding, it did last a long time. So we have Goguryeo, Baekje, and Shilla as our 3 main kingdoms, and then the confederated small kingdom of Kaya. So Goguryeo was the northernmost and had the largest landmass of the 3 kingdoms. And to the north were the barbarians. And so they had to work on maintaining boundaries to the north as well as to the south. And among the 3 kingdoms, they shifted alliances a lot, kind of like if you have 2 siblings and the 3 of you are always forming different alliances against the 3rd sibling. Baekje was located in the southwest part of the peninsula, and although you might think that the southeast Shilla would have closer ties with Japan, it was actually Baekje that had the closest ties with the Japanese islands. Some people of Baekje willingly or unwillingly went to Japan. And Kaya was the small confederated kingdom located between Shilla and Baekje. It actually was 6 separate states, and they were the first to be defeated in the unification wars. Shilla was the longest lasting because it came out victorious in the unification wars. They were located in the southeast, and they actually relied on Tang China for help to defeat its neighbors, and then it successfully ousted the Chinese, even though the Chinese were trying to take over Shilla to make it a part of their empire. And we see history from the Shilla point of view because Shilla won the unification wars. Perhaps the most notable monarch from Shilla is Queen Sundok. She succeeded her father. He was the last of the hallowed bones, which were the highest class. And she succeeded him because there were no more male hallowed bones, and class was much more important than gender in this time. And she is credited with having laid the foundation for the unification of Shilla. And under her, Shilla flourished culturally, technologically, and after her cousin, Queen Sundok, came along. By the way, I just learned something new in the last week. In Korea, they no longer call Queen Sundok the female king. Now that she's just known as Sundok Hwang, which is king or monarch. So that's an interesting change there. This is an observatory that was built during the time of Queen Sundok, and it's supposed to be one of the oldest observatories in the world that's still standing. And it has, interestingly enough, 27 layers of stone. It's supposed to be because she was the 27th monarch of Shilla, and also has, interestingly enough, 365 stone blocks, which we know is how many days there are in a year. And also is supposed to be the shape of a woman wearing a dress, because she was a female monarch. This is another piece that I like to show from Shilla. In fact, it's actually Syrian glass, which may seem like a long way for it to come, but Shilla was part of the Silk Road. And so we see that there were exchanges with lands far away. In fact, there's an Arabic text that talks about this distant land called El Sila, which we believe was Shilla. So it's really interesting that even in this time, there were so many exchanges with people near and far. So looking at Shilla culture and trade, it was it was one, as I said before, where class was more important than gender. So the aristocracy, they wrote in classical Chinese, and they shared this with the rest of East Asia. So if you were an elite in Korea or China, Japan, Vietnam, they all shared written literary Chinese or classical Chinese as their writing system. And Buddhism really flourished during this time, but it didn't just go through through Korea. It actually was part of a very active exchange of people and ideas. So Korean monks wrote lots, where they were prolific scholars of Buddhism, and they shared their Buddhist texts with people in other countries as well. It was also common for Korean monks to want to go to India to fetch scriptures. We also see other material culture from this time: metallurgy, silk production, sorry, hold on. I have my screen up, so I can't see that last part. Or textiles, paper making, Buddhism. It all contributed to a very rich material culture in Korea or on the Korean Peninsula. And in terms of commerce, people of different countries traded luxury goods with each other, and similarly, people in Shilla also wanted things from other countries. Okay, so Shilla underwent the unification wars, and in 668 it came out victorious. As I'd mentioned earlier, they had asked the Tang Chinese for help, and then when the Tang Chinese tried to take over, they successfully expelled the Chinese troops, and they had a few centuries of strength at this time. And Shilla was part of a very vast maritime trade. The Silk Road actually connected Shilla mainly through the seas, and some traders became very rich and even amassed not only money but also private armies to protect their fleet. So as later Shilla or unified Shilla started to wane in power, they had what was called the later three kingdoms, and a second set of unification wars arise. So although these people who founded later Goryeo and later Baekje were part of Shilla, they decided that when they were trying to rise up against Shilla, that they would take on these names of the old kingdoms. So they called themselves later Goryeo and later Baekje. And in the second set of unification wars, Wangun took over the throne of later Goryeo and then called it Goryeo, making himself the head of this new kingdom. Now, there's a really interesting piece. If you teach world history, world civ, I recommend that you Google this Cameron Hurst writing. It's on the internet. You can access it easily. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And he calls the founder of later Goryeo the ugly, the founder of later Baekje, he says, was the bad one, and Wangun is the good one. Now he's trying to show how history is written by the victors. He writes it in a way that I think world civ students can really understand. It talks not only about these three kingdoms and the three rulers, but also about history and historiography. So I recommend that reading. Okay, so Wangun makes himself King Taejo, the grand progenitor, and his kingdom is called Goryeo. It's founded in 918. And in order to get to be founder of this new kingdom, he had relied on a lot of the local warlords who had private armies. And so the way that he ensured that they wouldn't then turn on him was he formed marriage ties with a lot of the local warlords. So Wangun ended up with a total of 29 wives. And he also married some of the former Shilla royalty. And this was his way of consolidating power and to make sure that that these powerful warlords and other people would be placated with by having the king as their in-law. Okay. Some of the interesting time periods in Goryeo was this period of military rule. In 1170, some of the military officials staged a revolt against the civil officials because they were being mistreated. And this led to about a century of military power. So this is the true feudal period in Korean history. It didn't last as long as the Japanese feudal period, but Korea definitely had this feudal period. And by feudal, I mean in the European sense of feudalism, not in the other way of just calling anything old-fashioned feudal. The military leaders didn't try to usurp the throne. They kept puppet kings on the throne, but they were the ones who were really controlling the power, the government, and they had their private armies at this time. Okay. After the military coup, the Che family ended up rising in power, and they controlled Korea for many decades. During this time, the military rulers are in power, but they don't completely do away with the civil officials. And they also preserve the royal family as puppet kings, and they really didn't intermarry with the royal family either. They elevated some of their retainers and slaves, which led to some slave revolts in Korea, in Goryeo. And the feudal period ended after the Mongol invasions, which I'll talk about next. So the Mongol Empire was founded by Genghis Khan and continued to expand all the way through his grandson's reign, Kublai Khan's reign. The first invasion of Goryeo was in 1231. They had a total of 6 invasions in 30 years. The Che family actually ended up moving with the royal family to Gangwon Island. And this is kind of odd because you would think the Che family, their military leaders, they would stay and fight to defend Goryeo, but they didn't. And because the leadership had left the capital, peasants, low-born slaves were the ones who had to fight back against the Mongol invasions. The Mongols were very ruthless. They burned a lot of fields and destroyed the food supply, slaughtered many. And they also took a lot of people of Goryeo captive to make them slaves and servants. And it was also at this time that some of Koryo's most important treasures, like the Tripitaka, was lost. And finally, in 1270, the new king sued for peace with the Mongols and then returned the capital to Kaesong. So after that, we have this period of about a century of Mongol rule. And it was very complicated. So Goryeo became a son-in-law kingdom because the crown princes were married to Mongol princesses and raised in the Mongol capital. And many of the Goryeo elites also wanted to forge ties with the Mongols. So many of the elites became translators and high officials. This was also a time where there were many foreigners in Goryeo. So not only the queen dowager would be the king's mother, but the crown princess, the queen. So there are a lot of Mongols in Goryeo. There are also many people from Goryeo going to the Mongol capital and taking part in affairs there. Goryeo kings, because they were raised in the Mongol capital, made frequent visits back to the Mongol capital. And Goryeo was forced to participate in Mongol expeditions against Japan in 1274 and 1281, but neither was successful. And the Mongols were very demanding. They wanted a lot of silver, horses, furs, and even people as part of their tribute demands. Okay, so here we see a map of the Mongol Empire. It's huge. It was the largest contiguous empire in world history. The Roman Empire was bigger, but it wasn't all connected by land. So under the Mongols was also a time of cultural flourishing. So there was a lot of exchanges among the various different parts of the Mongol Empire. And as you saw on the map, really connected not only Asia, but also Europe as well. If you're familiar with Marco Polo, it was during this time that Marco Polo traveled to China and wrote about the wonders. He talked about, for example, how advanced China was in terms of their medical science, astronomy, science, engineering, all of this. And he also described the imperial palace at Shangdu, which we know in the West by the term he used, Xanadu, which is still used to mean some kind of like, paradise. The Mongol Empire, because it was so big, they had roads and they had systems of communicating through postal stations within the Mongol Empire. And the Mongols also promoted trade within the Mongol Empire. So this is a time of real flourishing. Here we have a trade ship, and it was sunk, and when they raised it, we were able to see what they had inside, the kind of things that were being shipped. And the Mongol Empire is also a time of really vibrant cosmopolitanism. So the Mongol capital, they called it Daidu, it's where Beijing is today, was really the center of culture. And many of the ruling elites in Goryeo went to Daidu to take part there. It was also kind of a prestigious thing for Mongol men to have Goryeo mistresses or concubines. And so there are a lot of Goryeo women in the Mongol capital. And as I said, Mongol princesses were married to Korean kings. So King Gongmin's wife was known as Queen Noguk. She was Mongol, but she's said to have really loved Korea. And Empress Ki was a Goryeo woman who became a Mongol empress because she rose up from concubine to ending up being the empress. But she has a bad reputation in Korean history. Here from a drama, we have King Gongmin and Princess Noguk here. And actually, this king is the one who ends up suing for peace. No, I'm sorry. No, he's not the one who sued for peace. Never mind that. Okay. And this is Empress Ki. It's also interesting how, there are different depictions. So these, on the two left images, you have paintings of Empress Ki, and then in the Korean drama, she looks like the one on the right. So they've really changed her appearance there. Okay, and then we go to Chosun. Chosun was the last kingdom of Korea from 1392 till 1910. Chosun arose when Goryeo was in turmoil, and there were some new military leaders who arose, and Lee Seong-ge established Chosun and called himself King Taejo, which is the same name that the founding king of Goryeo had used. And unlike the Goryeo King Taejo, who had 29 wives, Lee Seong-ge didn't do that. This King Taejo set up a system called dynastic foundation merit subject titles to his loyal supporters. So I've divided up my talk into two halves. So we've got the a quick little quiz here. You won't be graded on it, but why don't you fill it out? Okay, let me tell you, and while you do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Sejong. So King Sejong the Great is probably the most famous of the Sejong kings. He was the fourth king of Chosun. I'm sorry, not the Sejong kings, of the Chosun kings. He reigned from 1418 to 1450. And he appointed his smartest civil service exam passers to the Hall of Worthies. And his most notable accomplishment was probably the Hunmin Jeongeum. Oops, sorry. I went to it too soon. Whoops. Hunmin Jeongeum. And it was the phonetic Korean script invented in 1443, promulgated in 1446. It was also under, so there was a lot of print culture using the phonetic writing system at this time. Movable metal print had been invented really as early as the 13th century in Korea, but became much more common at this time, and this still predates the Gutenberg Bible. King Sejong commissioned a lot of history books, gazettes, geographies to be compiled and printed, and he also promoted a lot of scientific knowledge at this time. This is an example of the Hunmin Jeongeum, and you see there. Also important from, hold on, I'm trying to, can't see things. Okay, so Lee Sun-shin is the most famous general or admiral from this time period. And he defended Chosun in the Imjin Wars, also known as the Hideyoshi invasions, that was led by Hideyoshi of Japan. And they came through Korea on their attempt to conquer Ming China. Admiral Yi Sun-shin is said to have been the most successful admiral in world history, and he's credited with having come up with the armored turtle boats, the kabuksan, to defend Chosun. Yet ironically, although he was very successful, he personally ended up dying in battle. This is a painting of Yi Sun-shin, and this is a replica of kabuksan, of the armor-clad turtle ships in the National Museum of Korea. In 2014 was a really interesting high-budget CGI movie called The Admiral Roaring Currents about one of his battles. This one predates the armored turtle ships, though. Here we have another poster. And this illustration shows his strategy. So knowing that he was far outnumbered by the Japanese ships, there were 12 Korean ships and 330 Japanese ships, according to the film, that he made them all come through this narrow strait so that they could get them and not face the entire Japanese fleet at once. Okay. Also in Chosun, we had the Manchu invasions. So this is the Manchu who end up establishing Qing China. With the first invasion in 1627, Chosun pledged loyalty to Qing China instead of the Ming Chinese. And 1636, the royal family again went to Kanghua, just like had happened during the Mongol invasions. But unlike the Mongols, who didn't like going on water, the Qing didn't have any problems with that, so they quickly fell and ended up having to pledge tribute and loyalty to the Qing. During this time, there was a lot of fighting during the invasions, and this led to a peace agreement, and the Manchu Qings took over in 1644. Now, what's really relevant in terms of Korean history about this is that the Koreans really thought of the Manchus as barbarians. Even though the Manchus had taken over China, the Koreans felt much superior to them and were hostile toward the Qing. So Joseon saw itself as the last bastion of civilization. So people in Korea at this time said, oh, they'd better hold on to Confucianism, become more Confucian, because the Chinese would forget what Confucianism was since they were taken over by barbarians. Okay, so before we go on, this is the halfway point for my talk. I see we have a lot of chats.
Hey, got it. Taking care of them. Would you like for me to launch the second quiz, or is this the first quiz?
Oh, this is the first one.
Okay, got it.
So let me see. Let's talk about this. The first quiz, I wanted to see the, oh, I thought you already launched it. Oh, you didn't?
Right, I actually didn't mean to. So now here it is.
Okay, so even if you already filled it out, if you would fill it out again. The question is, how did Shilla defeat its neighbors in the first unification wars? The choices are, Shilla invented gunpowder and the trebuchet. B, Shilla allied with Tang China. C, Queen Hundok led the Shilla army herself. And D, Shilla decimated enemy food supplies until they starved to death. And everybody, all 29 people, said B, Shilla allied with Tang China. Good. And the second question is, what was Yi Sun-shin's role in the Imjin Wars? And 97% of you said admiral known for his military strategy. So that's right. So I think we have about 3 minutes for discussion. Any questions that you have about this?
Please feel free to unmute, or please post questions in the chat box.
Hi there, can you mention again about the Mongol Empire being the largest versus the Roman Empire? What was?
Oh, yeah. The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous empire, so connected by land.
Okay,
the Roman Empire was larger in terms of landmass, but it wasn't all connected by land.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Can
There, Professor Jung-Kim, do you see the question in the chat? How do modern day Koreans view their own history?
Oh, that's kind of a big question. Generally, with a lot of pride toward their history, it is, Korean people often talk about, how old their country is. There's a sense of a shared belief of a common ancestor from the Tangun myth. So there's a lot of pride about Korean history. So that's the simple answer. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. If not, I'm going to go on. We'll have a little more time at the end, hopefully. So when we fast forward to the end of Chosun, there were many foreign incursions, not from other Asians, but this time from the Westerners. So in 1866, there was the General Sherman incident where an American ship was trying to reach Pyongyang. The ship was set afire, the crew was killed. The French disturbance of 1866, where a French armada came, and this was supposed to be a retribution for the French priests who were killed. Also, we have the American disturbance in 1871, but it was actually in 1875 where the Japanese instigated an attack and were the ones to formally open up Chosun to an unequal treaty and unequal relations. It's kind of the same way that China and Japan had experienced at the hands of Western imperialism. This led to many other treaties with the West. And then with all of this happening on, there was a big domestic uprising called the Donghak Uprising. And this happened because peasants were very heavily taxed. The Japanese were economically stronger and were imposing a lot of difficult conditions on even Korean farmers. And the people who staged this uprising or revolt wanted to end the persecution of the Donghak believers. Donghak means Eastern learning, and there was also a religion associated with that. But it wasn't just about religion, it was also about corruption in the government and economic disadvantages. And they had four-point manifesto, which was do not kill the innocent or destroy their property, be filial to the king and your parents, drive out the Japanese barbarians, and clear the capital of powerful families and restore Confucian moral order. So the Donghak Uprising was very political, it was anti-foreign, it was nationalistic, and it was also socially conservative. They weren't talking about, having some kind of a revolution. They actually wanted to restore proper Confucian order. Okay. So the revolts started in 1892. By 1894, it was too much for the government, for the Chosun government to handle. So they asked for Chinese help. The Chinese notified that the Japanese, that the forces were coming, and Donghak, the rebels said, hey, we don't want this, we're anti-foreign. And so they promptly decided to abandon their fight, but the Chinese forces and the Japanese forces were already on their way. And this ends up erupting into the Sino-Japanese War, with Korea technically neutral between the two. So China and Japan are at war 1894 through 1895. During this time, Japan seizes the palace. The Queen Min is assassinated by the Japanese. And after this, the king's father is restored to the palace, and the war officially ends with the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. And with this, there's also, this is when China gives Taiwan to Japan, and Japan is also supposed to take the Liaodong Peninsula, but Russia, France, and Prussia intervene and make Japan give it back. But we see that the old power paradigms are really shifting because Japan, which had always been on the periphery of China, wins this war. During this time, 1894 to 1896, Koreans decide that they need to really reform Korea. And so they come up with this one committee comes up with 660 different reform measures. They make Hangul, the phonetic writing, the official writing system, not classical Chinese. They make a constitutional monarchy with a cabinet, and they bring about a lot of reforms in the economy, the taxation system, the military, education, the government, as well as a lot of social changes, like men have to cut off their top knots, widows can remarry, they have social leveling where they do away with the aristocracy and the different classes, they officially abolish slavery. So these are really big reforms at this time. And then Japan enters into a new war in 1904 with Russia. So what happened is the Russians had wanted to lease a port on the Korean peninsula because they have the city of Vladivostok that gets very cold in the winter. And when negotiations broke down, they crossed the Yalu River, and this led to war. Korea is again neutral between these two countries. And Japan, surprising the West, wins against Russia. So this is Russia, still under the czars, and Russia is very powerful. Yet Japan manages to defeat them in war, and this leads to the Treaty of Portsmouth. And at that point, Japan is considered to have won its right to control Korea. So initially, Japan takes over just international relations of Korea, but in 1907, they also take over domestic relations, and in 1910, they end up making Korea into a colony of Japan. But I also want to emphasize that Koreans aren't just accepting all of this, that there's a lot being done to reform Korea, and people are really trying to also educate Koreans about their own history, their own past, and there are a lot of resistance against Japan as well. So for example, the Righteous Army, using the same name as they had used earlier against in the Imjin Wars, people are forming guerrilla forces to fight the Japanese. And An Jung-gun is a Korean patriot who is celebrated in both North Korea and South Korea today for killing the Japanese prime minister in 1909. So then we have the period of colonialism, 1910 to 1945. And the Pacific War is another pivotal moment here. The origins go back to 1931 when the Japanese army engages in war with China in Manchuria. They establish Manchukuo as the puppet state. And the full war with China is 1937 to 1945. And it's also during this time that Koreans are really being made to as Japanese subjects. And I'm sorry, that's a typo. That should be 1945, not 1942 there. Okay, so, oops, sorry, wrong way. And we know about World War II. Japan enters into World War II with the United States in 1941. Okay, a few more things about this time period. The war mobilization is very important. Koreans, as well as people throughout the Japanese Empire, are mobilized not only for their material goods, but also the human labor, and they are made to work in factories, clear runways, and generally work toward the war effort. There was also a military draft in 1944 and 1945 of Korean soldiers, and military sexual slavery, where up to about 200,000 women from not just Korea, but also China, Philippines, and other places where the Japanese were controlling the areas, women were enslaved as military sex slaves for the Japanese Imperial Army. Now, with the imminent end of World War II, Koreans wanted to form independence. We're looking forward to independence. They formed a committee to do that. However, the United States and the Soviet Union decided to jointly occupy the Korean peninsula, and they did not want Koreans to have full freedom at this point. The temporary division of Korea into North and South became a permanent division in 1948 as South Korea became the Republic of Korea and North Korea formed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Both of these countries started competing with each other, and the Cold War took hold. And then another war that we have to talk about is the Korean War. So who's to blame? Really, there's a lot of blame for everybody. The United States has some responsibility because they divided Korea and they kept the colonial government system basically going in the South. And the Russians are responsible because they just wanted to advance socialism. And Koreans are also responsible because they could have tried to form a coalition government in 1948, but both sides were suspicious of each other. The North Koreans were definitely trigger happy because after the end of the Chinese Civil War and they returned from helping their Chinese allies, there were many border skirmishes between North and South. And there was also a lot of guerrilla warfare in the South as well. So war really seemed inevitable. So if we look at the war, this shows the different swings. I'm going to show it on the map. So the war began on June 25th, but quickly the North Korean troops had control over most of the Korean peninsula, except for that little blue corner, the Busan perimeter. And then after MacArthur landed, not at Busan where people were expecting, but here, you see MacArthur's landing there, and he cut off the North Korean supply routes. The Allied forces, South Korean troops, really were able to swing the tide the other way, where the Allied and South Korean troops had most of the of the peninsula. But at that point, the Chinese send troops to help the North Koreans. And that leads to pretty much stalemate and devastating losses, but pretty much the war ends pretty much where it started, not at the 38th parallel, but the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. So we can look at the Korean War as a civil war between the two Koreas. It was also a proxy war because the US and USSR were fighting indirectly. It was an international war because in addition to the two Koreas, 23 other countries were involved. The outcomes were devastating. This is very rough numbers, but the number of people killed, injured, uprooted was very large. And many families became divided. And this really cemented the Cold War on the Korean Peninsula. This is a picture from the Korean War. And then the next war that I want to cover is Vietnam. So in 1966, South Korea and the United States signed the Brown Memorandum, which basically brought about $1 billion to South Korea. About 300,000 South Korean soldiers were sent to Vietnam total during the war, and South Korea became a major supplier to the war effort in Vietnam as well. So many South Korean businesses, including the parent company of Korean Air, got started at this time. A lot of South Korean steel, transportation equipment was all exported to Vietnam. Here's a picture of some Korean soldiers in the Vietnam War. And since we're talking about wars, another thing I want to emphasize is that the Korean War has never ended. Both Koreas are still very heavily militarized, and although tensions wax and wane, the two countries definitely have a lot of hostilities toward each other, and that may also explain the North Korean nuclear buildup. Here we see the 6 different nuclear tests that North Korea conducted. North Korea also has developed the intercontinental ballistic missile system, and supposedly they also have a hydrogen bomb. Yet we also see progress. So this was the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics where the two countries' delegations entered together. Here during that time, we have the South Korean President Moon Jae-in with Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, on the right. We see the two leaders together here when Moon Jae-in went to visit Pyongyang. And looking forward, the main issues for the two Koreas be how to denuclearize North Korea, how to perhaps, either reunify, or short of that, perhaps have a peace treaty finally ending the Korean War, which could lead the way for North and South Korea to normalize relations and have full diplomatic relations with each other. South Korean trade with North Korea, and South Korea's on, how South Korea could provide humanitarian assistance to North Korea. Another question is whether South Korea would do this bilaterally, so engaging directly with North Korea, or whether this would be a multilateral effort involving many countries, and would the US be a part of this? So can we have the second poll, please?
Yes, I will launch the second poll. And there had been 2 questions that came up.
Okay.
Professor, would you like for me to put them in the chat again?
No, I can see them here.
Okay.
Let me see. Okay.
And the second poll is now launched.
Let's see, the question is, how is Mongol-Goryeo marriage managed in terms of language barrier and other accommodations of cultural customary differences? Okay, so the Mongol, I'm sorry, not the Mongol, the Korean crown princes learned to speak the Mongol language because they were raised there, their mothers and wives were Mongol, and also there were many people of Goryeo who were working as translators in the Mongol capital. So although Korean didn't die out, Koreans spoke Korean with each other, the Mongol language became like a second language for the elites. Okay, and then the next question is, I'm confused about why Korea was given to Japan after the Russo-Japanese War. Was Korea completely powerless at this time? You mentioned neutrality, and I feel there must have been more. Yeah, the whole war, the Russo-Japanese War was started because Japan wanted more control over Korea. And Russia tried to challenge that, but when Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War, the international community basically decided that Japan had won its rights over Korea. Certainly wasn't what the Koreans wanted, but Korea became what people often call a shrimp caught between 2 whales in both the Sino-Japanese War and this one. Another question, let me see. Do you have any special reason that you chose 3 Kingdoms period as a starting point? Yeah, because we don't know a whole lot about the wars that happened before. So since I was asked to focus on wars, I began with the first unification wars, which came with the 3 kingdoms. We don't have recorded history from before then. Let me see. Next question. I've read that reunification is considered inevitable by Koreans. Can you talk about that? Yeah, Koreans certainly, many Koreans feel that the 2 Koreas should be reunified, if not as one country, in some way, that there have been efforts. This was the whole reason behind Kim Dae-jung's sunshine policy, working toward peace of the 2. But if you ask young people these days, they seem to feel less of an urgency because to them, North Korea is another country. With the older people, many of them have family in North Korea, but I think with the young people, they don't necessarily feel that as much. Is reunification of North and South Korea possible anytime soon? I would say probably not. And also South Korea, or I'd say even most South Koreans don't say they want full reunification because they saw what happened in West Germany. It was very expensive, very difficult for German reunification. And so some people say, peaceful coexistence with 2 separate states or some kind of a confederation would be preferable. Let me see, next question. Did the first map you showed in the Korean War indicate that popular support was more with the socialist side? I assume that the question is for South Korea. I would say not everywhere. There were people in the South who thought that communism had a lot to offer, but also they didn't quite understand that communism wasn't talking about everybody just becoming landowners, that it was much more complicated. How much did Adam Sheffield and the Sheffield Treaty influence Korean history with the Korean War and the U.S. involvement? Let me see. I would say I'm going to come back to that one. Are the Three Kingdoms culture still around in Korea now? A lot of the regional variations probably also have their deep roots in the Three Kingdoms. Like, for example, during the Three Kingdoms period, people are believed to have spoken different languages that may account for the different dialects today. What else? Do people say I'm from Shilla culture? Not really, but people from that area, you know, I mean, like the city of Gyeongju today is considered a living museum, and you see all sorts of things from when it was the Shilla capital. So you see that, but people don't say they're from Shilla. But people in South Korea tend to have a lot more affinity with Shilla and Paekje, because that's where South Korea is located, whereas people in the north look much more at Goryeo. Another one, did Koreans also commit war crimes in Vietnam? Yes, definitely, and that has been coming out in the news and through Truth and Reconciliation committees. What percent of the country is of the senior age? Yes, South Korea definitely has an aging population and a negative birth rate, which is a real difficulty for South Korea today. What else? How were women treated in the kingdom's periods? Now, actually, until 1644, which is when the Manchu Qing was founded, it was, again, as I said before, a lot more, class was a lot more important than gender. So if you were an aristocratic woman, you really had the advantages of being an aristocrat, more so than a commoner man would. So, and all of this was the case until 1644, when the Manchus took over and the Koreans decided that they'd better be more Confucian than the Chinese. Next one. Have the inner Korean summits achieved anything in regards to reunification? Not really in terms of reunification. You know, having more peaceful relations, but not really working toward reunification. They've had, you know, different things like the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which I'll talk about in the next, in my next talk, and some of the other things that have happened. Let me see, and then let's look at our. Which of these was not an outcome of the Korean War? North, South. Okay. So the majority of people answered the Allied forces won the war and North Korea was forced to pay reparations. So correct, that did not happen. What was South Korea's role in the Vietnam War? South Korea, so people, 92% answered all of the above, which is correct. South Korean troops were sent to fight in Vietnam. South Korean companies and goods and services, sold goods and services to the US war effort, and South Korea received about $1 billion for aiding in the Vietnam War. So all of the above is correct. And there was one other question about the Sheffield Treaty, which I'll get to, but can we just open up to some general questions?
Yes. This is Lucy Park.
Hi, Dr. Park.
I have to put my nose in this thing. Yeah, there was a question about whether Koreans want unification. I'm an old generation, so yes, we want unification is in our blood, skin, and bone marrow everywhere. We dream of getting unification. And there are many younger generation talking about having some peaceful coexistence with the North. As an older generation, my friends and I represent all this older generation. We don't think that is possible because North Korea is just not normal. They're so crazy. How can you coexist when one side is so unreasonable? But we have no idea how that can happen. When I went to some of the seminars with some diplomats, they said unification can happen. Maybe it will take a long time, but they said, well, it could happen very quickly because you never know what's going on in the North Korea. So that's what I heard at many seminars I've been to, and talking to some diplomats.
So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay.
I see there's another question in the chat box.
Okay, hold on a second. How would it look to unify? Do both sides agree? No, they really haven't been able to agree. Earlier, whoops, sorry, this popped up. People had talked about a possible confederation and working toward reunification later, but there's really no consensus on that right now. Okay. Okay, so going back to the earlier question about the Sheffield Treaty, how much did it influence Korean history, the Korean War, and US involvement? I would say it wasn't really a direct influence. I would say that that opened up more to unequal treaty relations between the United States and Korea and Chosun in 1882. What happened later with the Korean War and after is a result of more of, I think, post-World War II relations. So I would say not really related. Also because Chosun was, the Chosun as a kingdom had dissolved in 1910. So earlier treaties wouldn't be directly relevant in 1945 and later. We get to go till 2:10, right? I think.
That's right, according to the schedule.
Okay, so 10 minutes. I know this is really rushed. There's a lot.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
Sorry, I keep popping in. There was a question from Kevin. Was that Kevin who asked how Koreans feel about our history? So we frequently talk about, oh, we were always in the war against Chinese and the Japanese invading from East. Jennifer mentioned that we were like a shrimp between the two whales fighting. But so one hand, it looks like we were the victim of big two countries. I mean, we are about 1/5 size of Japan and about 1/10 size of China. And the population-wise, it's a big difference. So we are really small. But on the other hand, other interpretation is we are really survivors. And there were many instances that after Korea and Japan had a war, Japanese, the dynasty was, was changed because they lost the war, and they after exhausting their resource in the war. But the Korean dynasty persisted, and similar thing happened in China. There was a very rapid turnover, especially after war with Korea. So the other interpretation is we are really survivor, and the Korean kingdoms has been lasted much longer than Chinese or Japanese, or even compared to any other country in the world. The Shilla Kingdom, Joseon Kingdom, all of them, they lasted very, very long. So that is another interpretation. We are really survivor.
Okay. Yeah, when I talked about a shrimp caught between two whales, I'm talking about the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, not all of Korean history. So I'm referring to 1894 to 1895, 1904 to 1905, at a time where that Japan is really moving toward building their empire and taking over Korea, and the international community is really complicit in this. There's another question. Have there been a high percentage of reunification of families so far? No, and by reunification, a lot of the family reunions have just been that short-term reunions where they meet in a very controlled situation, usually over a few days, and then that's it. So not true unification where one side is allowed to go move with the other one. Um, I've also seen some Korean Americans say that they actually immigrated to America because they wanted the opportunity to see their family members in North Korea, because as US citizens, they used to be able to go to North Korea through China. That's no longer possible today.
Can I share something?
Yes.
So I was born in Korea and I moved to America when I was a child. And I currently live with my maternal grandmother who's lived through basically the entire, like the modern Korean history. So it's like, it's really like, you've mentioned that young people are now kind of thinking that Korea, it'll cost a lot for two Koreas to reunite. But then since I live with my grandmother and since I've heard a lot of things from her, like I personally think it's like most ideal for two Koreas to reunite peacefully. So yeah, I just wanted to share that. And like two of my uncles have fought in Vietnam War. My grandmother like spoke Japanese growing up. She went to a school. She's lived through that like Japanese occupation, occupation period. So she was taught by Japanese people in school, and she's lived through Korean War and everything. So yeah, it's very like personal to me still, even though I hadn't like lived through that myself. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that it's pretty much still like real to even the young people as well.
Can I share my story too? Okay, my father came from North when before I was born. He was born in 1919, before Korea became independent. Okay, he was police officer in Manchu area, and there was a story that he was accused of being Japanese ally. So he had to took off his badge and then he moved down to South Korea. And here I am after that. He died when I was in elementary school. And after his death, and we had like peace talk between North Korea and South Korea. I was in middle school and we had TV stations broadcasting and people are holding up the signs, you know, about their family members in North and South and things like that. I put the sign and asking for my father's family in North Korea. But we didn't get lucky. So I spent there a whole day, whole month, and looking for my father's side family. But I was not captured in TV or anything like that. It was going on for a month. And at that time, I felt that, yes, we got to be reunited. But because of geopolitical reasons that although we always wanted to be reunited, it never happened. And might not be happening anytime soon because all these big countries, China, United States, Japan, Russia, we are all surrounded by all big countries in the world. They have their own interest, political interest. They don't want Korea to be reunified. And as for young generations, and Professor mentioned about young generations, did not really care about reunification, but I think there's a trend right now that a lot of young generations want reunification because of economic benefit. We can take advantage of cheap labor from North Korea, and we have a lot of technology and resources in South. If we become reunited, then we can be one of the very powerful politically and economically strong country in the world. We are now 12th in the world economically, but if we become reunited, we can use a lot of resources in North, natural resources and cheap labor, and South, our head intelligence, technology altogether, will become very powerful country. which all the other neighboring countries do not want that to happen. So that's just my thoughts.
I think one of the things that's interesting about Amy and Ashley's stories is that they both have family in the North, that they have family that came from the North. So their experiences might be different than a family, than young people who don't have relatives in the North, who, you know, don't feel any kind of personal urgency. So in terms of the reunification issue, I'd say, you know, it really, you know, long term might be good for South Korea, but it's not going to be easy. Like if we saw in terms of what happened in Germany, you know, East Germans flooded into West Germany, and you know, it took some years for West Germany to be able to fully integrate, and that happened, and you know, with a regime collapse in the East. In the two Koreas, if it's not a regime collapse in the North, it would be also a very different kind of reunification. A regime collapse could come, you know, from within, for example. But, you know, again, it's all very complicated as to what a reunification would look like. Somebody asked, you know, what's the main obstacle to it? Somebody else said it would be Kim Jong-un. Certainly, Kim Jong-un wants regime survival. It's his entire family, you know. But you know, we'll have to see. I think one of the big things that changed is, you know, South Korea and North Korea always used to not want coexistence, yet in 1991 they both jointly entered the United Nations. So I think change is possible. It's as we've seen, it's not going to happen quickly because Kim Il-sung died in 1994 and North Korea has been able to stay in power. I mean, the family has been able to. So we'll have to see. Okay, we are right about a few seconds short of 2:10. I am a big stickler on staying to your schedule. So, Ginny 선생님, do you?
네, thank you. I think we'll wrap up this part of the lecture here. Professor Jung-Kim will be back for the second part at 2:30.